Are you looking for adventure? Do you want to find peace? Long-distance trails offer you freedom and discovery. They offer a way to connect to yourself and to the world around you at the same time. The most popular trails have become crowded, but there are so many other trails that have plenty of space. The Trails Around the World podcast is here to introduce you to new trails and to new types of trails and to expand your horizons. Join me as we explore, finding out what is possible and how to do it. J.R. Harris, welcome to the Trails Around the World podcast. Could you tell us a bit about your background and your, we might say, adventure resume?
Sure. Well, to start with, I'm a native New Yorker. Forget about it. Lived here my whole life. Grew up in the city. City's so nice, they named it twice, New York, New York. And, I was an urban kid. I grew up in the street. My folks, working class, lived in projects, city housing projects. And, it was a environment, asphalt, concrete, bricks. And I knew nothing about mountains or forests or anything like that. I tell people that the first time I ever saw grass, I tried to smoke it. And when I'm 14 years old, suddenly my folks say, "Hey, we're going to assign you up into the Boy Scouts." And what do you mean, sign me up in the Boy Scouts? For me, like when you grew up in the 1950s, I'm 78 years old, so 1950s when I was a teenager, you didn't want to be a Boy Scout if you lived in a city, not this city anyway. And they said, and not only that, we're going to send you to summer camp in the mountains. And I was like, what is going on here? What are you doing to me? You're exiling me to Siberia. What's going on? And they didn't want me to be in the street in the summer. I got it. I ran with the crowd. I wasn't doing anything illegal, but, that the line between legality and illegality for a teenager back then was pretty fine. And my folks didn't want me to cross it. So their answer to that was to ship me out in the summer up to the mountains and be in a Boy Scout camp. Now, when I came back, I went kicking and screaming. I didn't want to go. But when I got there, everything started changing. I started to see things I never saw before. I started to learn things I had no idea about, like how to read a map and how to make a fire and how to use a compass, how to set up a tent, how to live essentially in an environment that I had no experience with before. And that's really what started it. My folks didn't send me up there to get fresh air or to experience what it was like to be in the outdoors. I mean, they had no clue. They'd never been there themselves. So their idea was to just get me out. Now, when I came home and first thing I got, as soon as I walked in the door, I asked them if they would send me back the next year. They couldn't believe it. What do you mean? You went crying and yelling, and now you're back and you want to go back again. And I did, and I went back again, and then I went back the year after that again. And that's how I started. I not only learned skills that are needed to kind of survive in the outdoors in the wilderness, but I also learned to appreciate the wilderness, appreciate the environment, the natural habitat of the animals that live there. Something I never shared before, never I had before. I had no clue about it until then. So that was really the start of it. Way back in the Stone Age. There were dinosaurs up there when I was there. No, I'm just kidding.
Well, that was in the Catskills, wasn't it?
That was in the Catskill Mountains, yes.
Yeah.
2 hours from New York, but a million miles away from me
Yeah.
back then.
Well, what about hiking, which all of this turned
Yeah.
into, I think? What about hiking makes you love doing it? What's special about hiking?
Well, here's about hiking. Now, hiking to me is really just putting one foot in front of the other. So I try not to get too, high and mighty about hiking when it's really just a simple thing. I love to walk, and hiking is maybe walking a little bit longer, or maybe it's walking on a trail instead of a sidewalk. Um, what I like about hiking is seeing the world at about 2 or 3 miles an hour. It's the pace is just enough to make some distance, but at the same time to see what's happening around you, to experience the walking that you're doing, and for that reason, and that reason alone, I love to walk. I love to walk, whether it's in the city or in the middle of nowhere. But that's really to me, it's the pace that allows me to see what I want to see while at the same time not having to stop and look around. I can keep on moving and keep looking around. So it's really the pace.
How long have you been hiking?
About 422 years. I started when I was in the Scouts, and
Right.
you know and so yeah, and I've been doing it ever since. I love doing it. I'm doing it now. I still do it. After
Hmm.
all these years, and I have no intention of stopping doing it. The Now, when at first I considered myself a hiker way back then. I got my hiking merit badge, for example, in the Boy Scouts. But then I switched to backpacking. I never really switched to backpacking. I evolved into backpacking. And backpacking to me took it to a different level because when I backpack, uh, it's not about trying to backpack and try to get somewhere. I use backpacking to get to achieve something that I want to learn about, or to get to something that I want to see. So it's not really backpacking just for the sake of backpacking. It's backpacking because that's my mode of travel to see something or experience something in the wilderness that I want to experience. For example, if I want to visit a community that's way off the grid someplace, and I have to walk 2 days to get there, the backpacking is really about getting to where I want to go to see and experience what I want to see. It's kind of a mode of travel, if you will. At the same time, what I like about backpacking, and this is what I really like about backpacking, is living a simpler life. Is
Hmm.
living a life where the only thing I have in my possession, all my worldly possessions, are in a pack that I'm carrying on my back. And if it's not there, I don't have it. And if I don't have it, I have to learn to live without it. And so to spend time in the wilderness, a lot of time, which I do, which I like to do, it's so different from my life back home that I feel I'm living two different lifestyles. I'm capable of living both here in the city, but also any wilderness area in the world, because I've learned the skills as a young kid in the Scouts, uh, and I was able to use my curiosity about what's happening in the world to go out and get there, usually by foot. So it enables me to live a different lifestyle in a different environment, and I love that.
You're in your 70s now, I think, right?
Oh yeah, I'm still in my 70s, but not for
Yeah,
much longer.
yeah, I had that feeling. So as someone who's in my 50s and I've got arthritis in my hips and my lower back and I'm trying to figure out how to do not only do more of this but keep doing it as long as possible. What advice do you have?
Well, actually, it's pretty simple for me. If I have to give advice to somebody, it's basically just staying in shape, as good a shape as you can stay in, and then whatever shape that is, to then make the adjustment for your hiking or backpacking, so that you can still have fun doing it. Because if you're not having a good time, then you're wasting your time. And so when I'm on the trail, sometimes I see people who are almost as old as I am out there. But even when I look at my own hiking and backpacking, I can say now, having done it all these years and being 78 years old, my pace is a little bit slower. The weight that I carry is a little bit lighter, but um, I'm still having fun. I mean, I'm still enjoying it. And and to be honest, when push comes to shove, I could still drop 20 miles a day. If I have to get there, I could still crank it up a gear and get where I have to go. But it's about the journey, not the destination. And if the journey is pleasant, then everything is good. And so I try to stay in shape. In fact, I love backpacking and traveling the wilderness so much that is my motivation to stay in shape, because I know more than anybody else, having done it so long, that if you go out there and you're not in shape, it's not going to work. I mean, every minute is going to be a hassle. You're going to wish you were back home. And so, yeah, to me, I just do what they tell you to do. Get enough sleep, eat a reasonable diet. Don't do anything crazy. Get yourself some. Be active. Go out and walk around, or what have you. It's really quite simple to me. I also play tennis. I should mention that too. So
Yeah.
I've been playing since I was 10 years old.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, it's just try to stay in shape, and then whatever shape you're in when you get there, just make whatever adjustment you need to make in your hiking or your backpacking, so you can have a good time.
Well, you mentioned tennis, and that makes me think of the. I mean, tennis uses your ankle muscles and such a lot, which of course is very important, not only for aging and not falling and having balance and that sort of thing, but also for hiking. That's often well, it's the comparison between cross country running and road running also,
Hmm.
where you need that mobility in your ankles and the musculature built up in the small muscles there and that sort of thing.
Well, it's also important, if you're a backpacker or a hiker, to have good boots. I never backed off buying a good pair of boots. If it costs a lot of money, I just pay a lot of money. Pays
Hmm.
off in the end. I buy the high top boots because I want the support in my ankle, and because it's helpful when I'm carrying a lot of weight. Also, because I most of my trips are solo, my pack weight is going to be a lot heavier. Well, not a lot heavier, but it's certainly going to be heavier than the average, because there's nothing I can share out with somebody. If I'm going with another guy or two or three other people, I can say, all right, you take the stove, you take the first aid kit, you take the water filter, you can kind of share the common stuff. But being by myself, when and having to carry it all, I want to make sure that my feet and my ankles are in good shape, and so I've always made sure I had the best boots I could afford.
Among through hikers, it's become very popular to use trail runners. Have you ever
Right?
made that switch or tried that?
No, no, I'm not a trail runner. I don't like those. I those the shoes they wear, those low cut boots and lighter boots. I don't have the support. I don't feel as confident as I want to feel hiking over rough terrain and carrying a pack.
Right.
So yeah, I'm old school. I'm going to carry my. I'm going to wear my heavy boots and just not worry about it.
Yep. Do you use hiking poles?
I always use one pole. From
Yep.
back in the day. As a matter of fact, I used to use a a mop handle as a hiking stick. I cut off the mop and I just took the stick. And if you look at some of my old photos from back in the day, that stick I'm carrying is what I used to use to mop the floor. And I still have it hanging over here, my old one. Now, of course, I used a Lecky, two sticks with super lightweight and blah 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 blah. And actually, I just started that on my last hikes. The first time I ever used two hiking sticks was a couple of weeks ago on my last backpack.
Mm-hmm.
Up to then, I only had one, uh, and I don't know. That was how it was back then. Nobody used two, way back then.
Yep.
I'm a relic, man.
But it works.
It's working.
So in this episode, we plan to talk about the Canol Heritage Trail.
Right.
I had approached you and I'd asked about another trail that you'd done recently, and you suggested this instead. And it's a long trail through the deep wilderness of the Yukon Territory in Canada. Do I have that right?
Well, actually, it's the Northwest Territories.
Northwest Territory.
It goes from the border of the Yukon Territory
Okay.
across the Mackenzie Mountains to the Mackenzie River in the Northwest Territories.
And so you have a book. We'll talk about it at the end, I think. And it is a chapter in your book that talks about this. Now, it was originally built as a pipeline route during World War II, right?
Yes, it was a pipeline from the northernmost oil fields that were known back in the 1940s. That oil field was on the Mackenzie River in Canada at a place called Norman Wells. That's where the wells were. And right after the attack at Pearl Harbor, which started World War II, the American military planners were fearful that there would be a Japanese invasion and that it would come through the Aleutian Islands and Alaska and then down through Canada into the west coast of the United States. The strategy they came up with was to meet that invasion if it occurred as far from the lower 48 as possible. Let's do it, they said, up in Alaska. This is the reason why the Army built the Alaska Highway right away, to have a roadway up through Canada into Alaska. And they were able to move a lot of equipment up there, planes and tanks and trucks and everything. But there was no oil. And that was the big problem there. And the only existing oil fields up in Norman Wells was a good 600 miles from the Alaska border. So the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, they came up with this idea of let's build a pipeline from the oil fields all the way across the mountains and down into just below the Alaska border at a Whitehorse in the Yukon Territory, where they built the refinery. So they were going to pipe that oil all the way across those mountains so that they would have a supply readily available in Alaska. And so you might ask, well, why didn't they just put the oil in a ship, oil tanker or what have you, and ship it up there that way? And the reason they didn't do it was because they were afraid that the Japanese submarines would torpedo the oil and it would never get there. So for that reason, they decided to build this oil pipeline rather, and they called it Canol pipeline. Canol meaning Canadian oil. And what fascinates me is how big this project was and how nobody knows about it.
Yep.
To build that pipeline in the early 1940s, it had never been done before, especially in that terrain, that kind of terrain on muskeg and tundra. They had so much to learn. Plus, they had to do it so quickly. They needed that oil right away. And so they basically threw a lot of money at it. And the thing became enormous. At its peak, there were 50,000 men working on this pipeline. It cost the government $300 million in 1942 money. This is more expensive than the Panama Canal and a bigger project than the Hoover Dam.
Wow.
And yet nobody knows about it.
Yeah.
I mean, that's really what fascinated me. It's like, wow, how could that happen? Now, the fact that they were able to build that pipeline, given the weather conditions, the terrain, the speed with which they had to build it, the lack of knowledge that they had trying to build it over those swampy, muskeggy terrain. This project was amazing. It was really amazing, and nobody ever heard about it.
And they completed it in something like 18 months, right?
Yeah, they completed it in just less than 2 years, which is amazing. They
Yeah.
had they had oil spills, they had snowstorms, they had swarms of biting bugs, they had all kinds of animal grizzly bears and everything up there. Um, and yet they were so determined to push this pipeline through. And keep in mind now, this pipeline, I mean, the pipe itself was only about 22 centimeters. It was only, you know, less than 10 inches across, in diameter. And they laid that pipe right on the ground, which is unheard of now, and the
Right.
ground was not exactly level. I mean, that ground was not exactly flat.
Right.
So yeah, enormous problems. And then the other thing that made it huge was, how do you get all the equipment that you need to build a pipeline all the way up to Norman Wells to begin with, and then across the Mackenzie Mountains? Enormous amount of supplies that had to be up there for all those men, for all those miles. I mean, just the number of pipes that you need.
Right.
They shipped up 250,000 tons of equipment up through the wilderness in an area where it had just never been done before.
Well, and this is
Just fantastic.
before the age of helicopters.
Before the age of helicopters, before the age of freight planes that could carry heavy loads.
Right.
They had to ship everything up through the United States into Canada to a place in Alberta called Waterways. This was the northernmost railroad in all of North America back then. Now, once it got there, it was still 1,100 miles from there to Norman Wells. And it was on the Athabasca River. You had to take that river all the way down until it emptied into the Great Slave Lake, and then across that huge lake in a different kind of boat to the where it outlets at the beginning of the Mackenzie River, one of the longest rivers in the world, and then down the Mackenzie River all the way to Norman Wells, which is just below the Arctic Circle. And so anything that they shipped from the railhead in Waterways to Norman Wells, it took over a month to get there. And they were shipping, again, 250,000 tons
Right.
of equipment up there. Unbelievable. And this is even before they started building the pipe. I mean, this is in order to build the pipeline.
And how many miles or kilometers long is this?
Is the pipeline?
Yeah. Or is the route either way?
Well, yeah, the route to get the equipment there is a good 1,100 miles. Then the pipeline itself from Norman Wells into Whitehorse, where the refinery was, it's about 600 miles.
Mm-hmm.
Now there were other smaller extensions of the pipeline in and around the refinery that were built later on, but the basic pipeline, that's how long it was.
And how much distance did you do?
So the section, well, what happened was, of course, um, by the time they got the pipeline finished, the U.S. Navy fought the Japanese at the Battle of Midway
Right.
and basically sank 4 aircraft carriers and put a real hurting on the Japanese Navy, to the extent that the threat of invasion pretty much died away. And not only did it die away, but shipping was reopened again, and oil that they wanted to ship up to Alaska, they could now do it in a ship instead of depending on the oil pipeline. The pipeline itself, there were a lot of problems maintaining it because in the winter, the pipe would crack. There would be a lot of leaks. They would have to get crews out there to do it. It was a very expensive, very tedious um, endeavor. And so after that Battle of Midway, they decided basically that they didn't need the pipeline anymore. You know, it had only been open like 6 months,
Right.
and and so they decided to just close it down and pretty much forget that they ever did it. They they shipped all the people back out. They left most of the equipment is still there. They did take some of the pipe. They sold it off. But you know, if you go out there, what happens is about every 40 or 50 miles, you know, you're walking through this beautiful, pristine mountain wilderness, and you come to an old road maintenance camp or an old pump station, and the old Quonset huts, you know, are deteriorating. All of the equipment is still there. It's all rusting out. And then you leave it and you back into the wilderness again for another couple of days. And then 40, 50 miles later, you come to another one. So, you know, all the remnants of the pipeline are still there all these years later. Now, the pipeline, of course, they had to build a maintenance road alongside the pipeline.
Right.
And that road from the Norman Wells, the pipeline itself, which was called Mile 1, all the way up to the border of the Yukon and Northwest Territories, that 233-mile stretch is now called the Canol Heritage Trail.
Okay.
And that's the segment that I walked.
Okay. So, off the top of my head, conversions here, to get it in, which isn't as much relevant to what you hike now, but that was, you said 1,100 miles, so that's about 1,800 kilometers. And you said that the length of the pipeline was about 600 miles, so maybe 950 kilometers. And then you said that the distance of the current trail is
233 miles from
okay.
McMillan Pass, right on the border, down to the Mackenzie River.
Okay. Ballpark is 350. Here, let me do a conversion on that, since that's probably the most important number for people thinking about this.
Yep.
Okay. 233 miles
300
is 375 kilometers.
375. Yep. That's it.
So
1 kilometer at a time. It's
that's a
long
big
trip.
walk.
Yeah. It's a stroll. It's a stroll. And I'll tell you something else. In that whole entire stretch, there is not a single town. There's nobody living there.
Yeah.
Uh, there's nothing there except wilderness. It's one of the largest wilderness areas left in all of North America. Then as now, still the same way. It's not a national park. It's not a national forest. It has no designation. The local First Nations or Native people still live there. Uh, but even they don't live there. They live mostly on the Mackenzie River. They may go into that area to hunt and fish, but nobody lives there. And when I did that hike, I didn't see another single hiker in the entire stretch that I did. And it took me 3 weeks. I was there 20 days.
And that's, it seems to me, really the incredible thing about this. I mean, this, it's almost, well, it is difficult to express. This is one of the most remote places in the world.
That's right. That is true.
I mean, I've been on
It,
islands way out in the Pacific
mhm,
and realized this is one of the most remote places in the world. And I was in Afghanistan on the border with Iran,
right.
and that was probably the, in terms of
Yeah.
mainland, that was one of the most remote places I've ever been. As I was flying in there, it was wow. There's not much here, um, but this place you're talking about, uh,
Oh, it's
there's
huge.
nobody
It's
else
really
there.
huge. No, no, nobody goes there. I mean, you could charter a plane and fly in, go and do some hunting, and then you go back out. A couple of days later. But there's nobody there. There was never anybody there, and there's still nobody there. It's just off the grid. It's too far away. You can't farm there. You can't raise any cattle. You can't do any grazing. There's no trees to cut down. But having said that, it's gorgeous. It is beautiful. If you like mountain scenery, this place gives it to you. And gives it to you in big heaping doses. It's really uh, tremendous, spectacular scenic route, Kenzie Mountains.
So I again trying to explain the scale of that. If one thinks about the Pacific Crest Trail, the
Right.
Continental Divide Trail, which are the two of the big three trails in the U.S. that are more remote. The Appalachian Trail is pretty well known to, it doesn't go through towns so often, but it goes near enough that one can resupply every few days. But even on the Pacific Crest Trail and the Continental Divide Trail, my understanding is it's unusual that one has to carry more than 7 or 8 days of food, or almost unheard
Well,
of.
yeah, it is. I've done, I know, maybe 800 miles on the Continental Divide and maybe 600 miles on the Pacific Crest Trail. Uh, I don't know, maybe 600 or 700 miles on the App Trail. Um, but yeah, you're right. You can resupply. You can even get stuff mailed in to the nearest post office that you're walking through a town. Out on the Canol Trail, you have none of that. In fact, the trail itself, in a lot of places, is just overgrown because it hasn't been used. It was a gravel trail; it was never paved, and large sections of it over the years, it's just kind of overgrown. Now you can still pretty much see it most of the places, but the other factor is that all of the rivers and streams that had to be crossed, and the army, of course, they built bridges across there. But those bridges are long since gone. They got washed away usually by the spring floods, just wiped them away. And so um, you have to make your way across all these rivers and streams on your own, and that's probably the biggest objective hazard to to doing the trail. The Canol Trail, let's just say it right from the beginning, is really not for beginners. This is a trail that you probably shouldn't try unless you have experience backpacking in the wilderness and that you're comfortable on a very long trip with very little chance of being rescued right away if you get in trouble. Apart from that, it's not really a difficult trip in the sense that the Canal Trail used to be a road. It was a maintenance road for a pipeline, and because of that, it's not really super steep. There's no climbing. There's no rock scrambling on this route. There's not even really major navigational problems because the trail pretty much follows in the valleys and along the different rivers. So it's easy to find it. It's easy to stay on the trail, but the trail itself is not like trails here in the States that are maintained. It's just it's there. You have to sometimes push your way through it through the undergrowth, but you could still find it. It's not for beginners. This is a place where you don't want to get stuck because you don't know how to get out of a situation that you're in. In fact, I'll tell you something. When I was there, when I did this trail, it was in 1997, right? And when I showed up in Norman Wells, which was had a population there of about 300. 90% of them were Native Canadians or First Nations people, and they see this guy get off the plane and go walk into town. I'm all alone, and they're like, "Who are you?" And like, "Why are you here?" And I told them I was going to walk the trail, and they thought I was crazy. They said, "Hey, Dad, you don't want to do that. Uh, we don't even go out there." And I said, "No, I'm going to go." And so they said, "Listen, about a month ago, earlier this summer, the Canadian Army sent a group of special ops people to go on a training mission along the Canal Trail, and they had to get rescued. And now they say, you're telling me now that you're going to take you're going to take yourself by yourself. I, I was like 50 some years old at the time, and you're going to do this trail alone." I said, "Yeah." And they said, if the special ops people can't do it, what makes you think you can do it?" And I said, "Well, the special ops people are not backpackers, and I'm a backpacker." And they were saying, "Listen, you see these mountains around this town?" I said, "Yeah, I see them." He said, "Why don't you go spend like 2 weeks up in these mountains close to the town here, and then just go back to New York and tell everybody that you hiked the Canal Trail?" I said, "No, man." But they didn't believe I could do it. So I say that to say it's not a trail for beginners. And here's the thing too. Now, when I finished the route, 3 weeks later, and I'm walking back into the town, and this guy comes by in a pickup truck, and he stops the truck, rolls the window down, and he goes, "JR, you made it back." Now, I never saw this guy in my life. Okay, I don't know how he knew my name or whatever. I said, "Yeah, I came back." He said, "Oh, when did you get back?" I said, "I'm just getting back right now." He said, "Oh, that's incredible." I said, "Well, what's so incredible about it? I mean, what are you talking about?" So he says to me, "Listen, when you left, everybody in the town got together and they had a lottery to try to guess when you would come back. And everybody kicked in some money, and they picked a day and a time and the person who gets closest to your arrival time wins the pot. And then he said, now if people didn't think you were ever coming back, their money went into like a little separate pot. And if you never showed up, the people who said that, they would split that money. So I said, well, how many people put their money in the pot there that said I would never come back? And he said, oh, just about everybody. So I said, well, thanks a lot. And
Yeah.
then Sunday, I came back at exactly the day I said I was coming back. And the one guy who picked that day and won all the money, he actually threw a big, what they called it a sheep feast. And we went out to his like ranch just outside of town, or his homestead, and we had a big, everybody in the town was there. It was really a nice get together. But they were so surprised to see me showing up again. So again, I say it's not a it's not a trail for beginners, but if you if you have experience and you want to see, if you want to have a an adventure and do something that's different in a place that has pristine beauty, but that can be incredibly unforgiving, that's the place to go. That's the trail to take.
And as you would imagine, the first thing I did was go and put the name into a search engine. And there is you can find stuff on this, and it's been updated
Now you can.
recently. Yeah.
Now you
Well, I
can.
mean, there aren't a lot more people doing it now.
No, no, I can
Um,
understand why, and it's not just because of the trail. It's also it's expensive. I'll say it that way. What I did when I got to Norman Wells, I decided the way I had planned the trip, and the way I would recommend anybody who wants to do it, is to go out, fly out to McMillan Pass, fly out to the far end of the Canol Trail on the border with the Yukon, and then walk back to the town. And so what I did was I chartered a bush pilot and bush plane in Norman Wells, and I had him fly me all the way out to the end, so I could walk back. But on that flight out to the end, I had the pilot land twice, and at each place I jumped out and I stashed a week's worth of supplies. And so when I got to my drop off place, I had to carry 1 week's worth of supplies to get me to the first resupply. And then from there, that took me to the second resupply a week later. And then that supply took me back to Norman Wells. So I didn't have to carry more than a week.
right.
Uh, and that I think is the easiest way, because I've read about people who've gone the other way, who started walking from Norman Wells all the way out to the end and then arranged for a plane to come out and pick them up. But if you do it that way, then you have the problem of you have to make sure you get there in time. There's no easy way to communicate back and forth if you're running late or anything like that. Or maybe there is now. Now, understand, when I did it, there was no GPS, there was no cell phone, there was no, internet was just starting. I was totally cut off for the whole 3 weeks. Nobody could contact me, and I couldn't contact anybody. And so I wanted to structure my trip where I didn't have to rendezvous with anybody. I didn't have to make sure I got to a certain place at a certain time. It was just let me walk. I know where my food supply is, and I'll just keep walking until I get back to Norman Wells. And
That's an excellent point. I mean, now with satellite communications, you have, Garmin InReach and Zoleo and
uh,
this kind of thing. You can relatively affordably stay in touch from a place like that, and communicate with, by text messages, or even carry a sat phone and a
Yep.
iridium or something, and talk with the bush pilot and get yourself rescued, which makes it much more doable, I suppose.
Oh yeah. Yeah, there's
But
no question about it.
I think also it's important to emphasize what you're saying about logistics. That I know I did we were mentioning the Pacific Crest Trail earlier. I've through hiked the John Muir Trail, and the
Mm,
John Muir Trail does the essentially the high part in the Sierras of the Pacific Crest Trail,
right.
and it includes the what I understand to be the longest carry of food on the
Good.
Pacific Crest Trail, which is about 8 days. So I did that, and going back to your point about having a week of food per place, that's pretty close to the limit of what one can carry on one's back, especially in a bear canister, which you probably didn't have at the time, but now
No.
one would probably do that.
Yeah. 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 It was heavy load. Um, because even the freeze dried food, and the equipment that we had back then, or that was available back then, and, there was no such thing as ultra light. Or everything was what it was. And at the same time, I carried all my garbage out. And there was no place I could leave it. I was carrying at the end. I was carrying 3 weeks worth of garbage. In addition to all my other stuff. Uh, but that's the way it was, and that's the way it is. It was worth it. It was it's my favorite trip, and I've done over 50 trips around the world that were longer than 2 weeks, and plus I don't even know how many that were shorter than 2 weeks. And that one that really stands out among all the rest of them.
Well,
And
that's an amazing statement. Yeah.
it is. It is because I've seen a lot, and I've been a lot of places, and I've spent a lot of nights sleeping on the ground. This place is spectacular, and with the story behind it as well. It's like a once in a lifetime thing, and I really hope that they never fix it up, or they never make it easy. I probably shouldn't say that. It's probably a lot safer if they went in somehow, the Canadian government, and put a little bridge across all those places where I had to walk through the water, and somehow make it more doable, or safer. Maybe even fly a patrol plane, across that route every couple of days or something like that. There's been talk about doing it over the years, but I don't think it's going to happen because most people never heard of the Canol Trail, and very few people do it. But I thought that was one of the good things about it. It's that you're not going to get people passing you on the trail every 10 minutes. Uh, you have it all to yourself, basically, that whole
Yeah.
corner of the world.
Yeah. You're not going to have a trail family out there. Uh,
No, no, not really.
Unless it's a family of bears. Uh,
Yeah, that could happen.
yep.
Or
Uh,
wolves.
yep. Yep. Yeah. Was that where you had that experience with the wolves?
Yes. Yeah, I was about 10 days in, and I made a camp in an old torn down building uh, that was right off the road that had been used. I believe it was a pump station, not a road maintenance camp. I don't know what it was, but when I got there, there was half a roof there, and so there was part of the floor was still there, and so I could set my tent up on a nice flat surface there with a little shelter of a roof overhead. And after dinner, I was just standing around enjoying the scenery with my little mug of chocolate, and I saw a wolf was 10 feet in front of me, and I never saw it coming. I never heard it, and it wasn't threatening me or anything. It was just like looking at me. And then I looked over the other direction. I saw another one, and then another one, then another one. I saw six of them, and then they were acting like I mean they knew I was there, but they weren't doing anything threatening to me. And it occurred to me that they'd probably never seen a human before. And then the alpha dog comes up like really close, and then I got really scared because I didn't know if you should look at them or avoid looking at them. This whole thing about with a grizzly, you don't want to look at the grizzly because they'll take it as a sign of aggression. But yet, I was thinking if I don't look, if I look away, maybe they'll think I'm afraid. It's a sign of cowardice, and maybe they'll attack me. But none of that happened. After a couple of tense moments, uh, that alpha wolf turned and walked away, and the tension was broken, and they still hung around. And I remember I wanted to take a photo of them, but I didn't have my camera. It was behind me in my tent, and I at some point I reached around to grab it, and when I turned around, they were gone.
Hmm.
And I believe they heard something, another animal probably, and they decided we're getting a little hungry, let's not look at this ugly dude here. Let's go out and see if we can get some dinner. And they were gone. I waited. Geez, I was hoping they would come back, but it was the closest and most incredible wildlife encounter I ever had. The half hour or so that those wolves were there, you know, 2-3 meters away,
Wow.
or less, very close. And beautiful, beautiful animals, really, really fit and really healthy, mesmerizing eyes. It was just extraordinary experience. Never forget it.
Way out there.
For real. Yeah.
And anyone can go on your website and see that you're not joking about having a lot to compare it to. So your statement that it's your favorite of all the trails you've done
Yeah.
is a huge statement to make.
Oh yeah, it is. Again, I've been in the desert, I've been in the jungle, I've been in the mountains, I've been all over the world, for almost 60 years now. And to say that this is the one that's on top, there was a lot to compare it against. And very memorable trip. It's an extraordinary place. I would recommend it, and I have talked about it to people who have some experience and are looking for a new thrill or a new place to go or looking for something different on a trail. And I say, yeah, go on up to northern Canada, do the Canol Trail. To my knowledge, nobody's ever done it that I spoke to, but it's not going anywhere.
Yeah.
It's still there. It'll be there. Uh,
According to the websites that came up, they've been cleaning it up.
mhm.
So it sounds like it's no less wild, but it's a little more pristine, perhaps.
Yeah, they talk about cleaning it up and making it a thing, and I think it might happen. It's I believe though it's still going to be somewhat expensive to do it there. There are cheaper places you can go, but at the same time, if you want to do something that's off the grid and something that you're going to remember for a very long time, I think you should go online and check out the Canol Heritage Trail
Right.
and see what it's all
Well,
about.
and it's also actually a relatively manageable period of time. I mean, 3 weeks
Yeah.
Is the John Weir Trail is
Yep.
in that range.
Sierra High routes, same. It's about 3 weeks, 3, 4 weeks.
Yep.
Uh, so
Uh,
yeah, I mean, people do longer treks than that.
yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
so you're right. I think it's a manageable time frame.
Yeah. The GR20 in Corsica. It's about that
Yep. You got
same
20 in
time.
Corsica's. Yep. The GR20,
Yeah.
as they say in French, or as
Yeah.
they say in Corsica. But then you have to add a couple of days, in front and in back just to
Of
get there.
course.
I mean, it's not
Yeah.
accessible, readily accessible. I mean, I flew from New York City to Montreal, then I switched planes and I flew from there to Edmonton, Alberta. And then the next plane up to Norman Wells didn't leave until the next day, so I had to spend the night in Edmonton. And then the next day take that like one flight a day, or back then it was maybe 4 flights a week up to Norman Wells. I sat in Norman Wells 3 or 4 days because the weather was bad and bush
Right.
pilot couldn't fly. And and then when I got back and was on my way home, I basically had to retrace. It was kind of a 2 day trip from there back to New York.
Right.
Maybe it's changed now, but it's still way out there.
What was the timing of the trail? I mean, you're talking about weather restrictions or other limitations. So, what season can one do this trail in, or does one need to do this trail in?
Well, first of all, don't do it in the winter time. The best time would be the time I did it, I believe, and that's late summer. I started in like early to mid September, maybe, or maybe it was late August even. If you go too soon, like in the early summer or late spring, you're gonna get swarmed by bugs, and take it from somebody who's been in Alaska during the wrong time of the year. With the black flies in the daytime, mosquitoes at night. You're not, it's just too much. If you wait until later in the summer when the bugs start dying away, and the melting snow that's in the springtime and overflows the rivers, that's all gone. And so I would say, the sweet spot would be from late August to mid September. Now, when I did it, I started out and the weather was great, but uh, by the time two and a half, 3 weeks in, it started getting cold and it actually started snowing. I had several days of snow. Now it can snow there any day of the entire year. So there is no way that you can guarantee not having bad weather. You may get lucky and it's all good. But if I were going again and if somebody asked me when's the best time to go, that's what I would tell them. I would start maybe the third or fourth week in August and do it for 3 weeks into mid September.
So, you mentioned that you did not do this ultralight, and it's after Ray Jardine came up with the term, but it's before it really became
Yeah.
popular. Which is around the turn of the month. I mean, the early aughts is when ultralight really started getting big, and this is 5 or 10 years before that. Um, but what sort of equipment did you use? Anything out of the ordinary for a backpacking trip? What sort of shelter were you carrying? What did you actually use?
I'd say I had all the standard equipment. It's just that it wasn't. I mean, it was the latest equipment for
25 years
that
ago.
time period,
Yeah.
and it was good stuff. I mean, I've always, I want the best equipment that I can get because almost every trip I take, I'm alone. and I don't want to have an equipment breakdown, and I want to be able to have confidence in the gear that I'm carrying. And so I had good stuff, but it was heavy. It was I was wearing wool, for example. In terms of clothing, I had an excellent tent. Back then, it was called the Bibler eye tent.
Hmm.
It was a single skin, very lightweight, two-person tent, self standing, and I'm still using a Bibler tent. Well, now Bibler sold it to Black Diamond, and Black Diamond now sells the same tent. They still call it an eye tent. That tent is fantastic. It was lightweight for its time because it had no canopy. It didn't really need one. It was waterproof Gore-Tex, and so I didn't have to worry about my shelter. And I had leather boots back then, which on that trip, I probably had those boots already several years, so they were well broken in. I had plenty of clothing because the weather was so variable, and I didn't want to get caught with not enough clothes and being cold. So with what's happening out here now, with all the fleece and all that good stuff, I could probably uh, be just as comfortable with less clothing. I didn't have a puffy or anything to keep me warm. I had a I had a camera that used film. Does anybody remember film? They used to have film in the camera, folks.
I
Uh,
Yep.
and and on these on these trips, I would take like 20 rolls of film,
Yeah.
but that's a big bag of film, and you had to back in the day make sure that it never got wet, make sure that it never got cold, make sure that it didn't get stepped on or sat on or slept on. I carried it in a large Ziploc bag, and even Ziploc bags were fairly new back then. And the other thing about film was you had only a finite number of pictures that you could take.
Yeah.
So once you ran out of film, that was it. As opposed to a digital camera, you could put another tab or whatever you call it in the thing and take more photos. You could take as many as you want. Also, a digital camera, you could take a photo and then look at it to see if it came out.
Yeah.
And if it didn't, you could just while you're standing there, you take another picture.
Yep.
What I had to do is, if I lined up a shot, I took the photo, I wouldn't know until I got home if it was in really in focus or if it turned out right. So apart from having it as a whole separate piece of a bag full of equipment, if you want to call it that, which had its own weight, and also you had to safeguard it the whole trip, and then you wouldn't see it until you got home. Then you had to take all those rolls and you had to go pay to have all the film developed.
Yep.
And that was the first time I would see what I had, and so now with digital camera, it's everything is different. Now, of course, you got GoPro, you got all the other, everybody's videoing and
Yeah. Yeah.
and taking drones and all this kind of stuff.
Well,
That
I
wasn't
know
happening.
the last film camera, but I mean, I like you, I went through several different film cameras over the years, but the last one I was using was actually the oldest. It was a 1960s Nikonos, which is a waterproof camera that was used by a lot of photographers in Vietnam, apparently. But it was a diving camera, so there was
Uh,
nothing that was going to. It was heavy, and it even stopped some bullets for some
uh,
journalists, apparently. But it didn't need batteries. Or I still have it, so it doesn't need batteries. And that's a big difference, also.
yes, yes,
So
yeah. Batteries are heavy.
yeah, but that was the upside of the film cameras is if I mean, you didn't have to worry about
Yeah,
running out of juice. Yeah.
that's right. Although I did have a camera once that the mechanism that it used to be when you took a picture, it would spin to the next picture, and then you would take that one and it would advance the film. And I had a camera where that mechanism broke and the film would not advance.
Yep.
And so you had all these other problems with cameras. You couldn't take the film out, otherwise you would expose it
That's
and lose
right.
all the other pictures that you took.
That's right.
So don't take digital cameras for granted. They're great.
Yes,
And you don't have to
absolutely.
take film anymore.
Well, and now people just use their phone.
That's
So, and you've touched on this already, but skills, knowledge, and abilities that a person would need to undertake this adventure, what would you say the most important ones are, and what are the different ways that people could acquire those skills, knowledge, and abilities?
well, the skills, knowledge, and abilities for this trip are essentially the same as any long backpack. The the critical factor, as far as I'm concerned, is really confidence, and that you have to be confident that what you know is going to get you through without anything tragic or anything really bad happening to you because you didn't know how to do it. The other thing about it is, even if you have all the skills and knowledge and whatever, it was the planning. You have to do real due diligence. You need to get a set of maps and sit down and study where you are, where all the especially where all the water crossings are. The crux to this whole Canol Trail is crossing the water, crossing the rivers. And one river in particular is called the Twitya River. Was too deep to ford and and pretty broad going across. The thing with the rivers is that when the pipeline was built, when they came to a river, they built the bridge across the narrowest part of the rivers, obviously, so that the bridge wouldn't be too long. But the narrowest part of a river is the place that you don't want to cross
Yep.
if you have to cross it, because it's going to be too deep and the current's going to be too big.
Yeah.
So whenever you're following the Canal Trail, when you get to a place and suddenly there's a river there, you know that you can't cross it there. And
Mm.
so then you have to go upstream and look, and then downstream and look, and find a safe place to get across. Now, if you didn't know that, then you could be in a bit of trouble. But I had the maps, and I studied the maps, and I could see where these various rivers got widened out and therefore narrower and with less current, and I could mark them off as possible places to cross. Now with this Twitya River, this is the one where the Canadian military uh, couldn't get across it. Back in the day, the information I had said when you get to the Twitya River, you have to build a raft. Build a raft? What? I mean, it was out of the question. I mean, you're going to bring a saw, and what are you going to tie it up together and all that. So before I left home, I had to figure a way to get across this river and several other rivers that were pretty big. And what I came up with was, some people bring like truck inner tubes, and they inflate them, and then you tie your pack to the tube. Do you know how much a truck inner tube weighs? I mean,
Yeah.
it's huge, and anyway. So I was trying to figure out how to get across, and while I was doing that, I was drinking a glass of wine that came in a cardboard container, and inside that container, the wine was in a bladder.
Yep.
And when I finished the wine, I took the bladder out and I blew it up, and the air stayed in it. And I said, well, now if I had several of these bladders, because they were very lightweight and pretty sturdy, heavy duty plastic
To
or
carry the
mylar
wine.
or whatever, I could blow them up when I got there, and then tie one at each end of my backpack until the pack would float, and then I would uh, put all my stuff inside the pack. I would put it in, wrap it up in big plastic garbage bags so it wouldn't get too wet,
Right.
and then I would take the pack and put it in the water and let it float, and then kind of swim across the water while pushing the floating backpack ahead of me. And with that kind of a system, it was lightweight, it was easy to carry. I could set it up whenever I needed to set it up. I even had a separate bladder that I blew up, and I could attach it to my chest like a life preserver,
Mm-hmm.
you know. And I remember before I left home, I went down to a lake just to because I wanted to try it, see if it would work. Uh, and so I took up my pack, and I remember I filled it with like 4 gallon jugs of water, so it would be heavy. And then I stuck these inflated bladders, tied it to the pack,
Mm-hmm.
tossed it in the water, and it floated fine.
Mm-hmm.
And so I say all that to say you got to plan it out. You have to anticipate, the things that could happen to you while you're on the trip, and have some kind of response for it. So it comes down to knowledge and experience, and mostly it turns out to it, it, it comes down to confidence and whether or not you have the confidence that your knowledge, your skill set, your fitness, and your experience are going to be enough to get you through while you are having fun. Because I always go back to, if you're not having a good time, you may as well stay home. Now, of course, every trip has its hard parts and easy parts, so nothing is fun from beginning to end. But you don't want to be suffering out there because you overlooked something or you didn't plan for something or anything like that.
Right.
So I would say careful planning, and good fitness and confidence, and you're good to go.
I'm listening to what you're saying about getting across these rivers. And are you familiar with what a pack raft is?
Yes, I am.
Yeah. So that
Yeah,
I think now one would probably use. I think
yeah,
they're down around 6 pounds. Plus you need a paddle, but
yeah, you need to paddle too. Yeah,
um,
yeah. The only thing is, of course, on a 3-week trip, you may use that.
that's it.
You
10 pounds. It's a lot.
Yeah, you got to carry it the whole way. You may use it a couple of times, but it's tough. To be honest, I think if I did it again, I would use the same setup that I did before,
Yeah.
because it only weighed like 1 pound,
Uh
if
huh.
that,
Right.
and it was a very small package. It fit anywhere easily into my backpack, and so all those miles that I carried it wasn't difficult at all.
Wasn't a problem. Yeah.
No.
And I think I know the answer to this, but many people would listen to the story about the wolves, and you were very exposed to grizzlies and this kind of thing. I mean, big
Mhm.
animals with big teeth and claws in general along this route, and no other humans around. It is definitely the animal's place, not yours. And what kind of protection might you have been carrying? Bear spray, shotgun, anything like that?
No, I had a can of bear spray that a guy in Norman Wells lent it to me. I didn't carry it up there because you're not allowed to take it on an airplane. And when I got to Norman Wells, there was no place to buy it, so I was going to go without it. And there was one guy in the town, and he said, "Listen, I got this bear spray. You can borrow it. If you don't use it, and if you survive, you can give it to me when you get back here in a couple of weeks." Now, the biggest thing I had was my Swiss Army knife, and I used to cut my cheese, and maybe to slice a rope or two. Um, but it didn't bother me. Yeah, you're right. There were grizzlies and wolves and moose and all kinds of animals out there. But I'm comfortable in that environment because I know how to react. I understand that this is their home and not mine. And for example, grizzlies, I know what the rules are. There's like 5 or 6 things you don't do. And if you don't do it, you'll be okay. And I've spent over a year in grizzly country alone and unarmed, not all at one time, but over the course of time. And I never had a serious encounter. I've seen grizzlies many, many times, but I think it's kind of a respect that you need to have for the environment of the wildlife that lives there, and an understanding of what you can do and what you can't do, and what could be hazardous and what is safe to do. And if you don't have this attitude that you're at the top of the food chain and you can do what you want, then I think your humility will carry you through, because it'll still be about common sense and recognizing where you are and what you have to do to get through it safely.
Right. Are there safety, security, health concerns that we have not mentioned?
No, I don't think so. If you're in good condition, like I say, if you're fit enough to walk for 3 weeks, well, take a long backpack, and if you're knowledgeable enough about the environment that you're walking in, I think the trip is doable.
Mm-hmm.
It's it's unique. I think largely because of its history and because of what happened up there with the pipeline and everything, and all these reminders every time you come to a road maintenance camp or an abandoned pump station, or see a derelict tractor or truck. It brings back the memory. You realize that all these years ago there were people here. There were men that were working up here,
Yeah, 50,000 of
and
them.
yes, a whole lot of them, and so just seeing those remnants up there and realizing what the history of it was is, I think, the extra added value. It's what makes it different from so many other trails. And then now for me, it was even more special being African American, because when the US Army decided to build this pipeline up there and had to deal with getting all that equipment from the railhead up to Norman Wells and then along the pipeline route where it could be used to build a pipeline, the Army shipped up a battalion of black soldiers, segregated US Army, shipped them up to be laborers on the route. They didn't build the pipeline, but they were hauling all the equipment. They would have to offload it from the trains when they got there at waterways, load it onto barges. The barges went down the Athabasca River. Every time they hit a rapid, they had to stop. They had to offload all the equipment from the barges, drive it around the rapids,
Wow.
reload it back onto a boat, float it back down to the next rapid.
Wow.
When it got to the Slavi River, the Slavi Lake, that lake is so big that they had to use a whole different kind of ship. And so they had to offload it there, put it on a bigger boat, float it all the way across the river to the outlet of the Mackenzie River, then take it all off again, put it back on a barge for rivers, and then ship it down the Mackenzie River. And again, every time they came to a rapid, they had to offload it, they had to put it in a truck, they had to drive it around. The other thing was that nobody back then knew how to drive the ships, the boats, the barges that were on the river. Nobody had any excuse. They at the beginning they didn't know where the rapids were. They lost a lot of equipment due to boating accidents and hitting rocks and things of that nature. Uh, but these soldiers, that was their job, you know. And when they went up there in the early summer of 1942, the first thing they had to do was to build cabins for the white soldiers who were coming up there so that they could live in a cabin. And then these guys had to live in tents and had to spend the winter, you know, in tents.
Uh,
They were not allowed to interact with any of the indigenous people that were living there. The soldiers told them that the black soldiers had tails or that they would eat them, that they would eat their children. And it took a while for the local people living there to realize that, you know, that these guys were just soldiers, you know, like anybody else. And so they had a really tough time. And that was, you know, for me, you know, because of my heritage, that made it an extra special thing. I wanted to go there specifically because I wanted to see what it was like for those guys who were sent up there. They didn't tell them where they were going. They didn't tell them how long they were going to be there. They couldn't tell their families where they were going. None of them had been out of the states. They weren't used to cold weather. It was rough. It was really rough. In fact,
really? Yeah.
when I came home, I I started looking to try to find somebody who had been there. You know, I wanted to see if there was any soldier still alive who had been stationed up there, and it took me 2 years, but I found the last living survivor or the last person alive who was in that army battalion that they sent up there, and I interviewed him on several occasions, and he told me the story. You know, he told me uh, how tough it was up there. You know, and so that was another reason for me to go up and experience that.
Was
You
he
know,
in
it
New
was tough.
York or somewhere else?
He's in New Jersey.
New Jersey.
Yeah, he's in New Jersey. Uh, and and interestingly, I found him because there was a Canadian Native American guy who was about my age, and he grew up in the Northwest Territories along the Mackenzie River. And when he was growing up as a kid, there were other Native kids like him who were half black, and their fathers were soldiers that were on this route.
Uh huh.
And so when he grew up, he became a playwright of all things, and he wanted to write a play about the soldiers and the kids that he grew up with. And so he was looking for a black survivor. Now he had photos that were taken by the soldiers when they were there with these kids' moms, uh, and so he actually had what I didn't have. He had actual photos of soldiers, and he was the guy who found the guy I found. And then when he found him, he contacted me, and then I got in touch with the guys. His name was Sergeant Toller, the soldier's name, and I went and visited him. And he said that when this Native American guy visited him earlier and showed him the photos that he knew every guy in that photo. And he said, "Oh yeah, that's Charlie Jones. You know, he was from Chicago. You know, and
Wow.
that's old Eddie's. You know, Corporal so and so." Yeah, when I found him, he was like close to 90 years old,
Right.
uh, still active. You know, he shot pool. He went bowling. He's still driving a car. He's living alone. A
Right.
really nice guy. You know,
Yeah.
and I really had a good time with him.
Well, and in a sense, I mean, for him to remember that well, people get very close in situations of adversity, and so
Mm, yeah, for
uh,
real. But his one regret was that nobody ever knew what they did. That
Right.
nobody ever heard of the pipeline. Nobody ever heard of the 2 years of hard labor that they spent while working up there. They joined the army to fight for their country, and as he said, the army gave them a shovel instead of a gun. And made laborers out of them. And yet they felt that they were contributing to the war effort because the country needed that oil to get to Alaska, and they were helping to get it there. But at the end of the day, nobody remembers the pipeline, and nobody remembers all the stuff they did.
So you're a single father.
Hmm.
You are an entrepreneur. You founded and are still running a business. The oldest. You say this.
All right, it's a marketing consulting and research firm. It's the oldest African American owned marketing research and consulting firm in the United States of America, and probably the world for that matter. I started in 1975. Actually, yesterday, October the 6th, 1975 is the day I started my company. I had been in marketing already for 9 years when I decided to go out on my own. This was right after the civil rights movement, and corporations were interested in selling their products and services to different minority groups. And so I saw an opportunity to start a consulting firm in New York City. And yeah, I want to stay in business for 50 years. So yesterday I celebrated 47 years. Got 3 more to go. Still going strong. Everything is cool. And uh, yeah, I'm proud of it actually.
Yeah, congratulations on that.
Thank you.
So obviously, you have had competing interests or competing demands on your time and income and all the rest. Just raising a family alone and running a business like this is would be enough, but you've been adventuring all over the world too. How have you made space for the adventuring in your life, and in both in terms of time and finances?
Mm. I get asked that question a lot. Like, how were you able to do that? I mean, you had to have a job, and you had 2 kids at home, and yet every year I would go out on a long trip. You know, Looking back on it now, I realized that it wasn't about how could I arrange my life so I could take a trip. What it is that taking the trip gave me what I needed to go back home and do my job and be a father. So it's kind of the reverse in a way. I realized that the time I spent alone in the wilderness and just getting away from everything else, and being on my own, and being kind of out of touch and living a different lifestyle, it was like re-energizing me. And I would come home a different person. I would be refreshed and ready to get back to work, and all that. Now, I did have my parents, who my kids' grandparents. They lived nearby here in New York City, and so I knew that when I was gone, my kids were safe. In fact, my parents lived close enough that my kids, when they stayed there, they knew kids who lived there that were in their school because it was in the same kind of district. So
Right.
it was really easy. Of course, my parents loved them, and they loved staying with their grandparents, so that was good.
Yeah.
And then for my business, I had a partner who was my brother, my
Hmm.
younger brother. I recruited him right after I started the business. He was just coming out of college, and it was the only job he ever had. and he could run it after, after a very short period of time. He knew how to deal with clients, and I taught him the business. And so when I went away, I could feel confident that my business was still going to be okay, even though
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't call him, I couldn't contact him, I couldn't
Right.
communicate at all. I never had to worry about anything because, basically he knew what I knew, and that, we being brothers, it would be he would be somebody I could trust and somebody I had confidence in. And so I had the best of both worlds, really. I was living a dream, all through those years. I decided when I started my business, I wasn't going to wait 10 years, until a business got established and secure before I went out and took a vacation. A lot of people I knew back then were saying, you just started your business. How can you be away for weeks at a time? It could wreck your business. And my response was, I want my business to work for my life, and if I'm going to be a slave to my business, then I don't want to do it. I want the business to be able to support my lifestyle and to be able to enable me to be away from the business for periods of time. And to be honest, it worked out great. It worked out really well. In fact, in 2016, I was elected to the Marketing Research Hall of Fame. My industry has a Hall of Fame, and I was elected into it by my peers. And only one person a year gets in. And so I did okay. I did okay
Mm-hmm.
in business. So yeah, I have clients all over the world, and I like it. And so yeah, I go back to, I'm living the dream. I like living in New York City. I like the business that I have, and yet, when I can get out of town and throw a pack on and disappear into the wilderness for a while, I love that too. I
Yeah.
mean, that's why I'm still good looking after all these years.
Amen.
Well, not all that good looking either.
So where do you, I'm sure this has evolved over the decades, but where do you learn about new trails? How do you find
uh,
them?
Everywhere. So somebody will send me an email and say, "Have you heard of this trail?" Or I'll look at Discovery Channel or National Geographic, and there'll be a program about the caribou migration, in Alaska, and people would say, "Oh, that's really interesting. I like that." I would look at that same show and I'd say, "I have to go there. I want to see that in person." And so it's the curiosity that really is the driving factor on this. My trips are not just trips to walk. My trips are trips to learn something, to see something.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to go on a glacier, so I went to a glacier. I wanted to see a caribou migration, so I spent some weeks up in Alaska and Canada. I'm especially interested in people. I have a degree in psychology. I studied ethnography, and I'm interested in cultures, and especially cultures that or people who live in remote areas, people who live a subsistence lifestyle, people who live off the grid. I'm curious, and I've always been curious about how they live and how that works. And in order to really do it, I realized I have to go there. I have to, I want to see it in person, and that's been the focal point of the majority of the trips that I've taken. So I've been to Lapland, where the reindeer herders are, in northern Sweden and northern Norway and Finland. I've been up there several times. I've been in Baffin Island in the Canadian Arctic. I've been in Greenland. I've been in Alaska several times. I've walked across the outback. I've been in Tasmania a couple of times. The Quechua people, the Inca descendants in the Andes, I went to visit them, and so I need to be able to walk there, or at least a final couple of days or whatever, um, But that's what I do. I want to learn something. I want to see, especially people, and I'll decide that I'm curious about, let's say, the Inuit or Eskimo people in Alaska. So I'll study their history and their culture and their religion and their tradition and what they eat for breakfast and everything. But I need to go there. I need to just see it for myself. And so I figure out how to get there, and I put together an expedition, one person expedition, and I
Yeah.
just go there. I don't know anybody. I've never been there. I've never seen it. And I get there, and then people, they're like, "Who are you?" And where's the rest of your party? No, I'm here by myself. Well, where are you coming from? New York City. New York City? That's crazy. Well, why are you here? What are you coming here? So I tell them what I just told you. I'm curious about your culture, your history, how you live. And they can't believe it. They're like, wait a minute, man. You mean to tell me you came all the way from New York City by yourself just because you're curious about how we live? And I say, yeah, that's it. And not only that, listen, I'm not going to be a burden to you because I brought all my own food. I got my own tent. I got all my own gear. I got all my equipment.
Hmm.
I said, and if you need help doing anything, any manual labor, for the time I'm here to help you. What I really like to do is just talk to people, uh, ideally the older people, and find out what you're about. And they can't believe it. They're so, amazed that somebody would come up. They tell me, our culture is dying. The young people don't want to stay here. They don't speak the language anymore. As soon as they get old enough, they leave. And when the older folks die, all that oral tradition is going to disappear. You know, and yet you come up here because you want to know about this. And so in the process, I've made a lot of friends around the world, just because I know how to listen to people. I can go there and I could sit and let them tell me their stories. And I tell you, they're just as curious about me, living in New York. What's that about?
Right.
How does that work?
Yep.
So it's kind of a two-way street there, and it's been great. It's been great. I've been doing it for decades, and I really enjoy it. That's really the crux of all my trips. In 1993, I was elected into the Explorers Club, uh, and so I've been a member now for like 29 years. I'm now on the board of directors of the club, and I'm actually chair of the club's diversity, equity, and inclusion committee. And
Right.
so all my time that I spent with indigenous people from different cultures, it's given me a lot of insight into how people live and how people relate and how people react.
Well,
So
and certainly in the world of exploration and expeditioning and adventuring, that club is much more than just a club. This is
yeah.
a very it's a real honor for you to have been elected into it and be serving on the board, and it's that's no small thing, for those who are not familiar with it. What my question here is, what trail do you dream of doing, or what do you plan to do next? I guess is also the, you know.
well, first of all, I'm just back from a trip. I
Uh-huh.
uh, I was in Swedish Lapland a couple of weeks ago for a long trip through the mountains. It was a backpack trip sponsored by the Swedish upscale clothing and gear company Foul Raven, and I spent time up there. That was really a nice trip. My next trip is probably going to be to Morocco. I have a trip that I've been working on that I was going to go on before COVID hit in the high Atlas Mountains of Morocco, and there are people living there called the Berbers.
Right.
And I got some maps, and I mapped out a kind of a circular route through the mountains that will take me through three, maybe four different communities out there in the mountains, and so I'm going to go out there and see who I can meet and see what I can learn, see who I can talk to. I can speak a bit of French, which in Morocco is the non-native language, and
Right.
so hopefully that'll be enough for me to communicate and gather some knowledge, and experience out there.
Yep.
So that's my next one.
Sounds exciting. And
They're all exciting.
right. Well, so how can listeners follow up, learn more about you, learn more about your adventures?
Well, if anybody's curious, that'll be great. You mentioned that I wrote a book. I also have a website. It's called jrinthewilderness.com. I'm on Facebook. I'm on Instagram. And yeah, if anybody's interested, reach out if you have any questions, or you want to plan a trip, or you want to know anything. I'm always happy to communicate with people who love being in the outdoors.
And I'll just say your book's title is Way Out There, Adventures of a Wilderness Trekker.
It's got 5 stars on Amazon. Five out
Yep,
of five.
it's a good book. It's fun.
Well, yeah, I try to tell simple stories. The difference I think between my book and a lot of books that I read about outdoor travelers and adventurers or whatever is because I waited until I got older to write my book. And some of the books I read, there's a lot of macho in there. I escaped this, and there was a storm, and I got through it, and I don't, and I think my book is more introspective. I talk about what I've learned, and how it's changed me, and and plus I've been doing it so long. I have a million stories. I could write 10 books. So
Yeah,
many incidents and things like that, and the fact that mostly I go by myself, and that I'm a person of color. People find different things that are unique about it,
right.
uh, and I think that's why the book is selling so well.
Well, the outdoor world is awfully white.
Hmm.
And do you have thoughts on? I'm sure you have many thoughts, but on this issue. But would you like to say a little bit to how greater inclusiveness can be encouraged in the outdoor world, the outdoor industry, people having more access, people feeling more welcome?
Yeah, I could speak to that. I've been backpacking all these years, and in all the years I've been backpacking, I never saw another person of color. Now fair to say that in most of my trips, I don't see a whole lot of any kind of people. So but I haven't seen other people. Most of the people that I see, almost all of them are Caucasian, like you mentioned. And when I see them, they very often mention to me, "Hey, I never saw a black person out here before." You know, and so for me, what I do is, when I come back from a trip, what I do is a lot is I go to different schools and I talk to kids and basically kids who grew up like me, kids who grew up from a working class family where their likelihood of getting a college education may not be that high. Their hopes and expectations may not be that great because of their situation. And I tell them, listen, don't let your situation stop you from dreaming. That if you want to do something, if you want to be anything, you can do it if you really, really want it. I tell them, nobody's going to give it to you. It's not going to be easy, but if you want it badly enough, you can do anything you want. And I'm proof that it can happen. I always wanted to be an explorer. People used to tell me when I was young, yeah, you can't be an explorer. You got to be rich. You have to have money. You have to be white. You have to be this, that, and the other. And it was my own parents. They told me, no, 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 no. You can do it if you want to do it. And I was able to do it. I did all my trekking that I always loved to do. I went into business. I started a company. I got a college degree, and not to push myself forward or anything, but if you need to know that there was somebody who was able to do it, then I'm telling you that I did it and you can do it too. And my presentation is actually called "If I Can Do It, You Can Do It," because I don't believe I'm special. I don't believe I'm anything but an ordinary guy, but I had a dream and I wanted it badly, and I was able to make it happen. And I believe that if I can do it, anybody can do it. And I tell you, the teachers all say to me, listen, we try to tell these kids this all the time, but until they actually can see somebody who's actually grown up like they are and was able to do it, that makes a whole lot of difference in the world. And it's really nice because a lot of times what the teachers do after my talk is they have a class with the kids, and a lot of times they'll ask the kids to like write a composition, like what do you want to be when you get older, and what kinds of barriers do you think you're going to have to overcome, and how committed are you to really make this dream happen. And the kids write it down, and then a lot of times the teachers send me the compositions, and to sit there and read it, I tell you, it's really uplifting, and and I'm not just talking about black kids. I'm talking about kids from working class, hard scrabble, growing up in the street, whether they're white, black, Asian, Latino, anybody. I want them all to get out there. I want everybody to be successful. I want everybody to have a good life. And so I try to pay it forward. When I come back and try to influence and maybe motivate these kids and tell them, listen, you don't have to be a slave to your background and your upbringing. You can make it happen if you want. So hopefully, you get a few, but that's what I do. That's what I want to do. I do it. I'm actually doing it next week. I'm going to another book tour. When I'm in town doing a book tour, I usually ask around if there's a school that I can visit and talk to the kids about it.
Right. Well, J.R. Harris, thank you very much for talking with us today.
My pleasure. I enjoyed it. Yeah, thanks a lot. Good talking to you, Mr. King, Mr. Sky King. Yeah, stay well, okay? And again, it was nice.
Thank you for listening to the Trails Around the World podcast. Please visit us online at trailsaroundtheworld.com, and please join our Facebook group under the same name. If you liked this podcast, please help us out by leaving a review on your favorite podcast source. This is Sky King, and I look forward to you joining us next time. In the meantime, happy trails to you, and please remember to leave no trace as you enjoy the outdoors.